Chapter 8. The Conspiracy View of History. In the eyes of most intellectuals, the hallmark of intellectual acceptability is to view history as the outworking of impersonal forces and factors, whereas the epitome of absurd, irrational, and even dangerously reactionary thinking is to regard history as in any sense involving conspiracy. Such a view is primitive and naive. It is a form of belief in the devil, we are told. As one scholar summarizes this perspective, quote, "In the modern world, the devil has all the characteristics of the medieval devil translated into modern terms. The devil is ubiquitous, insidious, powerful, and morally corrosive. He must be identifiable and recognizable as an image, but unidentifiable when at work. Groups that can serve as devil images must therefore be ubiquitous, insidious, powerful, morally corrosive. They must be identifiable as groups, but capable of disguise, indeed of making themselves indivisible in their operations. The Russian people or the American people can therefore not serve as devil. They are geographically localized and they are much like other people once you come to know them. But communism, Wall Street capitalism, imperialism, Freemasonry, and so on meet the requirements. The operations of the fiend are worldwide and secret. There exists a world conspiracy aiming at nothing less than the utter destruction of its foes, followed by world domination. The communist world conspiracy works through espionage, sabotage, and revolution. The capitalist conspiracy through incitement to war and through spies, wreckers, and saboteurs. The Jewish conspiracy, according to Hitler, works through race mixing, cultural poisoning, and warmongering against the German folk. The Great Conspiracy has a secret master plan which may accidentally become known." End quote. It is best at this point to call attention to the common dictionary definitions in the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, 2nd edition of conspiracy, which means 1. A, quote, combination of men for an evil purpose, an agreement between two or more persons to commit a crime in concert, as treason, a plot, end quote. 2, quote, combination of men for a single end, a concurrence or general tendency as of circumstances to one event, harmonious action, end quote. 3, quote, law, an agreement manifesting itself in words or deeds by which two or more persons confederate to do an unlawful act or to use unlawful means to do an act which is lawful, confederacy, end quote. It is at once obvious that in all three senses conspiracy exists, and that, in the second sense, it is present in all kinds of organizations and institutions. Indeed, at least in this sense, university professors are continually involved in combinations of men working for a single end with reference to their department and school, the trustees, and the country at large. Moreover, these intellectuals would not deny that a communist international exists whose goal is world communism, either through indoctrination, subversion, or revolution. They might approve or disapprove of that organization, but its existence is not denied. In justice to these critics of the conspiracy idea, it should be noted that for them, the basic issue lies elsewhere. Even if there is a self-proclaimed worldwide communist international in action, which is by its own profession a conspiracy, it can only be understood in terms of unconscious, impersonal historical forces. In this perspective, to see a conspiracy as a conspiracy is a naive misreading of history, a failure to analyze its basic currents, and an attempt to see historical froth as substance. To quote-unquote expose conspiracies is thus seen as a confusion of appearance with reality and an evasion of the basic problems and conflicts of history. At this point, it becomes apparent, first, that many conservatives have failed to do the liberals justice because they have failed to recognize the nature of the liberal position. Rather than an unwillingness to face the facts, The problem is a different framework for the facts and even a different concept of what constitutes a fact. For the conservative, the communist conspiracy is a fact. For the liberal, the fact is rather deep-seated and irrepressible historical forces which manifest themselves in various phenomena, and not the phenomena, but the underlying forces are to be reckoned with. Between the two positions, no real dialogue has existed because there has been no recognition of the radically different concepts of factuality which undergird them. Second, it is further apparent that many conservatives, not witness the libertarians, are liberals in their concept of factuality. For the libertarians, factuality is impersonal. It is the inescapable outworking of economic forces and has no place for the conspiracy idea. The libertarian differs from the Marxist, not in his concept of factuality, but only in his interpretation as to what constitutes economic forces and laws. In either case, this position, while ostensibly the faith of humanism and a faith in man, is actually the surrender of man and of any integral humanism to a blind impersonalism. Man's government is surrendered to impersonal forces and factors, and the essence of true order is non-personal. History cannot be surrendered to the personal predilections of individuals. The result of impersonalism is the reign of totalism and a drift into totalitarianism. Impersonalism leads many economists of the classical school of liberalism to see the reign of impersonal economic law as operative despite all that man may do. The psychologist sees man similarly under the power of impersonal psychological reflexes common to all men, either as unconditioned reflexes or as reflexes conditioned by particular forms of environmental stimuli. The meaning of man is thus primarily and essentially psychological. The biologist sees the impersonal facts of biology as determinative of all men. The physicist has a more basic interpretation and sees life and matter in terms of a determination by a theory of physical origins, and so on. Each area is thus an area of inevitable and total law, and other areas are to be seen, very often, in terms of the laws or concepts of the partisan sphere. None see man as in any sense capable of transcending these laws of origin, because man, having been derived from these sources according to their evolutionary presuppositions, is bound by his origins which determine his nature. But if we hold that man is a creature of God, not of nature, and is created in the image of God, then man must be understood in terms of his origin. The law spheres of nature are created by God and are under God and under man in Christ. Man's laws of origin are to be sought not in nature, which is under him, but in the Word of God, which is over him and governs him. This Word is the personal Word of the triune God to man, his creature. There is thus relatively little argument with reference to predestination. The question is this: is predestination natural, or is it supernatural? Is the, quote, eternal decree, end quote, governing man a totally immanent one, derived from natural forces, or is it a totally transcendental one, having its source in the sovereign God? The adherents of humanistic planning are champions of predestination also, of a coming or developing predestination. In their theory, a totally immanent predestination is necessary for man's salvation, and this immanent predestination is cradle-to-grave security, planning and control. But Orthodox Christianity insists on a transcendental predestination and refuses to place man under the determination of nature. This is his area of creaturely kingship and power, of liberty, not of slavery. But impersonalism denies this. It is guilty of the reduction of all of life to impersonal natural operations and forces, and since each law sphere, biology, psychology and the like, see man as under their law, they deny him both transcendence and liberty, and underrate other law spheres in the name of their determining law. Each area tends to claim total law for itself and to become totalitarian as it gains power. This, then, is the basic issue. Is factuality personal or impersonal? The liberal position has its variations. For Marx, economic forces are determinative. For Darwin, the forces are biological. For Freud, determination is biological and psychological in terms of the basic biology of man. Some interpretations of this basically impersonal factuality can be, as we have noted, quite quote-unquote conservative with reference to a particular area of thought, but the common denominator of all is that all factuality is ultimately impersonal and is grounded in impersonal being. This impersonal being has evolved into various forms and is characterized by a variety of developments, phenomena, and epiphenomena, of which consciousness and personality are instances. But the essence of being is impersonal, and the truth about factuality on which all valid knowledge must be premised is its basic and ultimate impersonality. History, therefore, must be read in terms of forces and movements which are impersonal, for to read it otherwise is to mistake accident for substance. There may be and are differences of opinions as to the determinative forces, but for any intellectually respectable person, there can be no dissent as to their ultimate impersonality. With this position, the Orthodox Christian must dissent. As Cornelius Van Til has repeatedly pointed out, the Christian, believing in a completely self-conscious and personal God, believes that all created factuality is personal because it is the work of that personal God and derives its being and its interpretation from him. There is no such thing as brute factuality, nor is there any impersonal factuality. The universe is not the product of blind, impersonal forces, but the handiwork of the triune God. Instead of being interpreted in terms of impersonal, evolving factors, it must be interpreted in terms of the very personal purposes of a wholly personal God. To the extent that impersonalism enters into a philosophy which is ostensibly Christian, to that extent it is non-Christian and even anti-Christian. History moves, therefore, not in terms of impersonal forces, but in terms of the very clearly personal decree of the ontological Trinity. Because God is truly sovereign, history is not only to be read in terms of Christian personalism, but also to be recognized as under law, predestinated, deriving its creaturely liberty in the fact of the ultimate and undergirding government of God. In this perspective, economic, psychological, and other factors are not denied, but they are not viewed as grounded in an impersonal reality and context, but rather as aspects of a personal environment. Since man's true and ultimate environment is the personal and triune God, man's immediate environments cannot be impersonal factuality. It must be the world of God's creation, to which man is organically related by virtue of his creation in God's image and his calling to be prophet, priest, and king under God over that world. History, therefore, is not the outworking of impersonal forces, but a personal conflict between the forces of God and anti-God, Christ and Antichrist, with the ultimate victory assured to God and his Christ. The Bible as a whole presents a view of history as conspiracy, with Satan and man determined to assert their right to be gods, knowing or determining good and evil for themselves. Genesis 3:5. From beginning to end, this is the perspective of Scripture, and only a willful misreading of it can lead to any other position. In Psalm 2, this concept of history as conspiracy is briefly summarized. It should be noted that no other psalm is more frequently quoted in the New Testament. Revelation is in a sense an expansion of the same vision. Psalm 2 was written by David in terms of a personal and national event, and he saw the cosmic crisis behind the local affair. The whole world is seen as organized against the Lord and in deliberate opposition to his rule, for David sees not himself, but the Lord Messiah as the true king. In verses 1 to 3, the worldly conference of the conspiracy is depicted. Quote, "Why do the heathen, or nations, rage, and the people imagine a vain thing?" End quote. The nations rage against their bondage to God, and they take counsel or conspire against God and his Christ, planning to create their own world order and law in contempt of him. In verses 4 to 6, the heavenly confidence is revealed and the certainty of the outcome. God laughs. He holds the nations in derision, but he gives evil time to mature so that the issue becomes clear-cut. His Son is already the ordained King of creation. In verses 7 to 9, the Messiah declares the divine decree in relation to himself. His kingship is authorized as the Son of God, verse 7. God endows him with all the earth, verse 8. He is given the power to overcome all his enemies, verse 9, and to destroy the conspiracy. To him the peoples and realms are promised as a gift for his victory and kingship. In verses 10 to 12, the nations are exhorted to abandon the conspiracy against God and his Christ, or else face destruction. They must either accept the scepter of Christ's authority and blessing, or be broken with a rod of iron. To this view of history, Jesus Christ gave his authority, declaring of the men of his day as they conspired against him that their conspiratorial objective was the seizure of the kingdom and inheritance through the murder of the heir. Matthew 21:38. While the liberals may view belief in the conspiracy view of history as absurd or even as a sign of membership in the, quote, lunatic fringe, end quote, the Orthodox Christian must assert it to be basic to the philosophy of history. But simply to accept the view of history as conspiracy is not in itself an acceptance of the perspective of Orthodox Christianity, for history is replete with conspiracies, and many conspiracies, while very important, serve only to deflect the minds of the masses from the central and essentially religious issues. To speak of the multiplicity of conspiracies is enough to make many liberals wince with embarrassment at the shallowness of such a consideration. But the issue needs to be faced with the recognition that intellectual respectability in the eyes of either the liberals or anyone else is an irrelevant matter in the discussion of any question. We must leave the dead to bury the dead. First of all, as we've noted, the conspiracies at any given moment of history are many, and the more crucial the issues, the more extensive the conspiracies. Let us briefly examine the administration of President Grant. Among the more prominent conspiracies were the Credit Mobilier affair, the gold conspiracy of Jim Fisk and Jay Gould, and the Whiskey Ring. There was also the Union League conspiracy in the South and the Radical Republican Reconstruction Plan, the Ku Klux Klan, the Loyal League, the White Camellias, the White Brotherhood and the Palefaces, all secret societies. Before the war, there was the Secret Six conspiracy, which involved John Brown, as it has been noted, and Benjamin Morgan Palmer's charge of a Jacobin program. But all this is only to scratch the surface. These are either the minor or the unsuccessful conspiracies. Thus, the known conspiracies of the Grant administration, as of most eras, are often not the most important ones. The successful and continuing conspiracies of history are never admitted to be conspiracies. Their known activities are extolled as virtues and patriotic works, never as illicit activities. Legitimacy is the reward of success, and only that which is seemly is admitted as acceptable party history. A second fact characterizes conspiracies, namely that the conspiracy view of history is denied not only on philosophical premises, but also on conspiratorial grounds. Thus, the existence of the Illuminati is either bypassed completely, or else its life is held to have been brief and ineffectual, and this in spite of the telling testimony of men like Abbé Baruel and John Robinson. After the supposed suppression and death of that conspiracy, the Reverend Jedediah Morse discovered its existence in the United States and exposed it, but he could not bring about its suppression. George Washington clearly accepted as true the facts stated by Morse. Freemasonry, the Illuminati, and Unitarianism were extensively interwoven, and they were the objects of an extensive counter-movement in the early 19th century, but the very anti-Masonic party was so infiltrated that its presidential candidate was a secret Mason. The National Bank idea was seen as a part of this conspiracy. Esoteric Freemasonic writers have asserted the tie between Freemasonry and the Illuminati. We have seen first that there is generally a multiplicity of conspiracies, and the more they succeed, the less they are recognized. Second, conspiracies are denied on conspiratorial grounds. Let us now consider a third aspect of the problem. The commonly admitted conspiracies are those of the opposition. The communists see themselves as a necessary development of history and only their enemies as a reactionary conspiracy against history. The liberal establishment sees itself as intelligence and progress incarnate, not as a Fabian conspiracy. The conspiracy for them is on the right. The conservatives recognize communist, Fabian, and sometimes Zionist conspiracies, but will not admit that they are conspiring against them, for what they represent is a defense of our constitutional heritage. Each may or may not be right, but to be in the right does not nullify the fact of conspiracy. Similarly, in the religious arena, the belief in conspiracy is prevalent. The Jews have their various organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League, to defend themselves against Christian majorities and, quote, anti-Semitic, end quote, conspiracies, but they will not refer to themselves as a conspiracy. The Roman Catholics wage a long-range struggle against the revolt of Jews and Protestants against the Catholic West, but they will not admit to any conspiracy on their part. Conspiracy is Protestant and Jewish in their eyes. Protestants are horrified at attempts of Roman Catholics to convert the United States to Roman Catholicism and of Jews to maintain a dual citizenship and to eliminate the Christian framework of the country. But they will not recognize conspiracy except in the opposition. But conspiracies can be either good or bad, and this is well known. The reluctance to call one's own position a conspiracy rests on the premise that destiny cannot be conspiracy. It is historical inevitability. Only that which seeks to conspire against destiny is conspiracy, which is some kind of desperate, dangerous, and yet futile attempt to stay the clock of history. And, in a very real sense, there is truth in this opinion. If there be any pattern, purpose, or direction in history, all counter-movements will, historically, be regarded as conspiracies against that nature or destiny. However, only those who fully believe in a transcendental predestination can avoid conspiracy, for they alone can rest in the confidence that it will be God's work. In most instances, the conception of destiny involves a fair amount of human pattern and purpose identified as ultimate, and hence conspiracy. But to represent destiny in any sense does not mean to represent either perfect virtue or infallibility. The Bible points clearly to the wretched nature of the chosen people of the Old Covenant and the heresies and sins of the elect people of the New Covenant. The various commanding empires of history, from Rome to the United States today, have not been preserved from grievous sins at their highest points. No party, religious group, or race, however confident of its cause and destiny, can afford the luxury of assuming that the righteousness of any cause that a man affirms is identical with his own nature. But the answer is not mutual tolerance, for unity and brotherhood movements are either desertions of one's positions for the religion of humanity, or else they are hypocrisy. The answer is not to be one, but to be under law rather than to claim to be law incarnate. It is the course of common sense to see one's real enemies as dangerous and evil, but it is also the course of wisdom to see oneself also as a sinner, different only to the extent that God's grace is operative in us. A fourth consideration with respect to conspiracy makes it evident, however, that history will see no lessening of the intensity of struggle and counter-movements, for the closer we get to total war, the closer we come to total conspiracy. In the 18th century, wars were fought, prior to the French Revolution, by small armies, usually professionals, with general respect for civilian life and property. General engagements were avoided, and a pressure of armed force and diplomacy was used on a limited scale to gain limited ends. Earlier, the 30 Years' War had been total war because total stakes were at issue. As the 30 Years' War began, the principals had certain basic and far-reaching issues at stake. Their total commitment made for the collapse of all law and order in terms of the greater eminence given to the cause, with the result that the most vicious were able to rise to the top very quickly, and total war became total crime. The men of the 30 Years' War era were not more debased persons than those of the War of the Austrian Succession. The totality of the warfare brought out the totality of their nature in a way which later wars did not. Despite all the unity movements of the 20th century, the fact remains that the underlying issues are more sharply drawn than at any time since at least the 30 Years' War, if not far more so. It is not surprising that total war is being waged, and the responsibility for initiating it rests, according to an English scholar, with Great Britain, which on May the 11th, 1940, began the total bombing of civilian centres. The war trials which followed were again instances not of justice but of total war, and were first exposed as such by Stalin. When the United States went through the hypocritical facade of a trial, Stalin apparently moved in sardonic humour to lay bare their hypocrisy by pressing charges for the Katyn forest massacre, of which he was known to be guilty against the Germans, to the embarrassment of the British and Americans. Prior to that, the very entry of the United States into the war, as well as much of the warfare, was not without its conspiracies. The UN, by placing total power within man's grasp, has accordingly heightened the potentialities for all total conspiracies. As a result, it is the stage setting for a vast interplay of forces that use the facade of the UN as camouflage for unrelenting drives to power. At each critical point of tension, such as Israel and Katanga, great and total stakes are at issue below the surface of publicized events. Total war is underway, and hence total conspiracy. A fifth aspect of conspiracy must now be noted. The more a conspiracy is concerned with achieving power rather than advancing to a faith, the more unscrupulous will its activities and alliances become. It will join forces with anyone and sacrifice both friend and foe without any moral restraint in order to attain its goals. The alliance of corrupt politicians with corrupt business, labour and religion, and clearly with crime, has long been noted. In the United States, the progressives and muckrakers waged a major battle against this alliance. Particularly important was the work of Franklin Hitchborn. But the alliance with crime is not a necessary ingredient of this position in which the primary allegiance is to power and a commensurate ruthlessness. And it is this type of allegiance that the various establishments appear to embrace. The activities of criminal syndicates, making pallid reading in comparison to the activities of communism, of Zionism, of the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, of foundations, and of many other groups in capital, labour, religion, education, and so on. Suffice it to say that all too prevalently, the lust for power becomes more and more contemptuous of moral law in its drive for control. With closer ties of communication added to international organisations, what once were village, class, or national cabals are now too often international scourges. A sixth aspect of conspiracy thus becomes apparent. The drive for power knows no limits. Its rationale is to be as God, and hence it is itself law in its every wish. Total warfare, in and out of war, and total conspiracy have as their goal total control. This means the control of men through their minds, which is achieved by controlling news media, schools and churches, and also the control of men economically, in particular through the control of money. There is no question that Andrew Jackson, in his veto message of July the 10th, 1832, believed that the Bank of the United States was a conspiracy against the people. Quote, unauthorized by the Constitution, subversive of the rights of the states, and dangerous to the liberties of the people. End quote. Wealthy and powerful Americans and foreigners were in league against the people behind the facade of the bank. Jackson could tolerate no evil as necessary. Quote, there are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. End quote. The Civil War saw the banking powers working on both sides to effect control of money and of civil governments and people through money. In the century following the Civil War, many powerful fortunes were established, and more than a few writers have ascribed great powers to them. There is no lack of truth in the main in such studies, but the heart of the matter lies elsewhere. Industry, transportation, news and other centres of power rest today on the foundation of finance capitalism and are accordingly predominantly subservient to their financial powers. Hildreth long ago observed the source of the danger. Quote, a bank, whether great or small, naturally and necessarily falls under the influence and control of a few individuals. If there is but one great bank, bank accommodations will be limited, for the most part, to the friends, favourites, protégés and toad-eaters of the few great capitalists who will usurp its management, and the monopoly of banking will tend necessarily to produce a monopoly of business, for those possess a monopoly of business who enjoy a monopoly of the means necessary to carry it on. End quote. And this has happened. Through central banking, nations and people are delivered into bondage to international finance. The Federal Reserve System was created ostensibly to remedy the financial situation. Attacks had been made on, quote, the money trust, end quote, and a very inadequate and faulty investigation of it made by the Pujo Committee of Congress. Its results reported by Louis D. Brandeis in Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It, 1913. With the Federal Reserve Act, the very evils criticised were quickly enthroned so that it could be said, quote, banking, as it is conducted today, is actually a conspiracy operating against society. End quote. One current scholar has titled his work, The Federal Reserve Conspiracy. What is the conspiracy involved in money today? The clue is in a statement made by Governor Mariner Eccles of the Federal Reserve Board before the House Banking and Currency Committee. Quote, debt is the basis for the creation of money. End quote. Not too long before America's entry into World War II, Eccles said, quote, if there were no debts in our money system, there would be no money. End quote. As far back as 1935, before the major expansion of debt money, it was noted, quote, that more than 95% of all the nation's money is based upon its debt instead of its wealth. End quote. This is a difficult concept for most people to realize. They're used to thinking of money as wealth, not as a permanent debt, and certainly not as an outright sale into slavery of their country and its future into the hands of moneylenders. The Federal Reserve System is a money trust. The Federal Reserve System issues paper money which the United States of America, on the face thereof, guarantees, not the Federal Reserve itself. When the US needs money, it issues bonds for the needed amount to the Federal Reserve System, which then issues to the US government the equivalent amount in new currency printed by the US Bureau of Engraving and Printing. At no cost to itself, The Federal Reserve issues or creates money against which the people must pay interest on bonds, and every expansion of currency is an expansion of debt. In contrast, when the Federal Reserve System itself wants new currency, it simply calls for it from the Bureau of Engraving and secures it debt-free. This fantastic system, common to most nations, is a form of slavery without manumission. Few protests have been made against the Federal Reserve System by persons in power, and such protests have been peripheral to the main issue. Let us examine some of the implications of Eccles's statements, that is, quote, "Debts is the basis for the creation of money. If there were no debts in our money system, there would be no money," end quote. When the US federal government wants money, $100 million for example, it prints and turns over interest-bearing bonds for that amount to the Federal Reserve System, which then creates money by simply asking the US Bureau of Engraving to print up $100 million. Three things are immediately created, as it were, out of nothing. First, $100 million in paper money, and second, a debt for those interest-bearing bonds, which will take more than $100 million to satisfy. But third, money, the measure and medium of wealth, now represents not wealth but debt, and the existence of most paper currency represents an almost irredeemable debt and mortgage against the entire country. Money that is itself debt cannot retire debt, because it represents every day it is in existence an increasing interest debt against the country that is above and beyond its face value. Although it is sometimes said of the national debt that, quote, "we owe it to ourselves," end quote, in actuality, we borrow from those in our midst to our providence and thus destroy the wealth and assets they possess. In consequence, although politicians may promise a balanced budget, they are more likely to gain the power they desire by increasing debt, for in a debt-free country, the citizenry is strong and the civil government is limited. In a debt-ridden country, taxes increase, liberties decrease, and the civil government, increasingly less responsive to the will of the citizenry, increases its own power over the people, even as it vastly enlarges the power of the invisible government over all. All in all, it is clear that debt is the road to total slavery, and the Christian, both as a person and in his organized society, must recognize the truth of Scripture when it orders, quote, "Owe no man anything but to love one another," Romans 13:8. Bad as this situation is, the Bretton Woods Agreement, 1944, establishing an international monetary fund, compounded the evil. The fund is exempt from law and taxation by any government, national or international, and it cannot be the object of any legal proceedings without its permission. The result is a money-making and money-controlling agency whose powers are steadily becoming closer to total power. In 1963, it was proposed by J.R. Cuthbertson, economist of Lazard Brothers and Co. London, merchant bankers, that before the price of gold be raised, all nations transfer ownership of their gold to the International Monetary Fund. Quote, "They would receive credit notes in exchange," end quote. At quote-unquote 0 hour, all nations would devalue their currencies in terms of gold. If gold were advanced 50% from $35 an ounce to $52.50 an ounce, quote, "the IMF would thus have an immense 50% bookkeeping profit on the transaction." The nations would have, of course, a 50% loss financially and a greater loss of self-government to a purely private agency. The IMF is a profit-making institution. It binds member nations to gold and the dollar, both of which are firmly controlled in the name of monetary unity. How shall we evaluate these things? It is possible, and many have done it, to begin naming the international political heads, some known and others unknown, who are involved at the heart of these things. But this is an exercise in futility. It has been done for more than a century, and before that, in many an era, without any appreciable effect. Knowledge is important, but it is not knowledge which saves men, and the public announcement of all the relevant names would in no wise alter the situation in any basic respect. The issue is theological. In this respect, the Fish Committee report on communism in 1931 was moving in the right direction when it defined communism as first of all characterized by and advocating a hatred of God and all forms of religion. Communism must be defined first of all in relationship to God. It is a religious movement, the politico-economic form of the religion of humanity. This is true of both the Marxist and Fabian branches. Similarly, the Federal Reserve System and the IMF rest on the same rejection of orthodox Christianity. Any directorate, even a very small minority, can exercise control when majorities are without faith and direction. Orthodox Christians were once such a minority, a threat to Rome and its eventual successor. More than the guilt of conspirators, however, which is very real, is a helplessness of the Christian West, a helplessness that is a confusion of its own sin and shame. Behind the, quote, money trust, end quote, are, first, the theorists, and second, politicians without faith or courage, and third, people who will not live in terms of the biblical laws with respect to debt. As we have noted, conspiracies are present on various sides and among differing racial and religious groups, but the basic conspiracy is against God and His Christ, and in some degree it includes us all. It includes the clergy who will not teach the biblical facts concerning usury, and the laity, who often work to keep the clergy poor and in debt to make them, quote, spiritually minded, end quote, and subservient. It includes all who sell their future to men by debt, for debt places one under man's sovereignty in a way that God's word does not permit, not in willing and godly service, but as a slave. Man must be in service to man only under God. The biblical law concerning usury or interest and debt is, in its main points, clear-cut. Debt is only to be contracted in emergencies, and no man, family, or people can mortgage its future. The maximum life of a debt was therefore limited to 6 years, all debts being cancelled in the 7th or sabbatical year, Exodus 23:10 following, Leviticus 25:1 following, compare Deuteronomy 15:6-11, 28:12-44. Security of certain sorts for loans could be asked of fellow believers, Deuteronomy 24:17, 24:6, Job 24:3, but not interest, Exodus 22:25. Unbelievers living by another law were not to be bound by this law, and interest could be exacted from them, Leviticus 25:36 and 37, Deuteronomy 23:19 and 20. Thus, at best, only a severely limited usury was permitted. With the Reformation, some Calvinists held to no usury under any circumstances, while others continued to affirm a strictly limited usury. Certainly, the Christian was enjoined by Paul to pay all due taxes and live debt-free, Romans 13:6-10. A truly Christian order, therefore, means not only a severely limited order with respect to time limits on debt, but also severely restricted with respect to usury. It cannot be one of debt money and of a debt economy. Bonds must thus be seen as clearly unlawful to the Orthodox Christian and to his institutions, for they involve a philosophy of debt and of continuing debt, for bonds are not generally retired when due. Indeed, bonds are the mainstay of debt money. Some bonds are perpetual, the most conspicuous example being the British consols, or the British government's 2.5% consolidated stock, of which some $765 million, including the consol 4%, are in existence. Bonds commonly are continued past their due date, the issuing governmental agencies rarely having the funds to retire them. In any case, bonds are a central aspect of a debt economy, the mainstay of moneylenders and a death knell to the liberties of a people. No, quote, money trust, end quote, can be destroyed merely by exposure or by knowledge of its existence. It can be rapidly destroyed as a people take seriously their faith in its every aspect and submit themselves to the sovereignty of God and His Word. Most, quote, fundamentalist, end quote, Christians are thoroughly, quote unquote, modernist in their radical disregard of much scripture, including its teaching concerning debt and usury, and in their limitation of its authority to matters of salvation and certain limited areas of personal and social morality. There is no preaching against the installment plan, bonds, debt money, long-term debts, unbiblical usury, and many related matters. For even a limited segment of evangelical Christianity to adhere to these principles would have a shattering effect on any, quote, money trust, end quote. The present debt economy will sooner or later collapse, destroying with it all institutions built thereon. A new and debt-free economy must even now be inaugurated in the healthy segments of society, lest chaos follow. The Cardinal of Chile, in The Mystery of Freemasonry Unveiled, cited several kinds of international orders, including the monetary powers, as the quiet powers working towards a tyrannical society. The critical issue, however, is not located in these international conspiracies, but in man's transgression. The results of his sin lie, quote, crouching at the door, end quote, threatening to master him unless he masters them by his own submission to God. Quote, if you do right, will there not be a lifting up? Genesis 4:7, Berkeley version. To regard the solution as merely the identification, denunciation and punishment of the, quote, money trust, end quote, is to evade the fact of the centrality of the religious issue, the requirements that man live by the whole counsel of God. Nothing can absolve man of this responsibility. A seventh aspect of conspiracy can be briefly noted, that is, its affinity to revolution. The fact of conspiracy rests on a sense of destiny, of inevitable progress. This destiny is not God's predestination, but man's inevitable triumph. Man must prevail. It is, accordingly, a humanistic concept, not a theological one. It is not surprising that many who believe that progress, seen as the triumph of man, is inevitable should naturally conclude that revolution will serve to expedite it, to clear obstructions to it and smooth the road of progress. Revolution is thus held to be important in smoothing the path of history by the removal of hindrances, and to be socially required in some instances, even when politically unnecessary. As a result, assassination is often an important factor in revolutionary conspiracies, as a means to eliminating roadblocks to destiny, and virtually all assassinations have this framework of reference. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy had many of the earmarks of conspiracy. Indeed, there was apparently not only a conspiracy to kill him, but also to use the assassination as a means to either discredit or even purge the right wing, and prominent personages were quick to level wild charges both before and after certain facts became known. Furthermore, the extensive attempt to cover up many aspects of the case seemed to have more than security at stake, and pointed to a conspiracy to prevent a free flow of news. The truth about Lincoln's assassination is still far from known, despite an quote-unquote investigation, and there is no less an attempt today to issue as little information as possible and to rewrite history via suppression. For whatever motive done, the management of information involves playing at God and is a conspiracy against the truth and the citizenry. These, then, are some of the aspects of conspiracy. The view of history as conspiracy, however absurd to the liberal with his impersonal philosophy, is a basic aspect of the perspective of Orthodox Christianity. As Psalm 2 presents it, the ungodly nations and peoples rage, they conspire together and imagine a vain thing. the triumph of their conspiracy. Precisely because it is a vain thing, the Orthodox Christian's philosophy of history cannot make the conspiracy, however central to the stage of history, the main fact of history. Believing as he must in the sovereignty and predestinating power of God, the meaning of history is for him transcendental. The main fact is the eternal decree and the certainty of the Son's victory. Who shall make the nations his inheritance and possess the ends of the earth in history and beyond history? Now, therefore, quote, act wisely. Be warned, O rulers of the earth, end quote, lest you perish in your way. Psalm 2:10, Berkeley version. This assurance of victory is the hallmark of faith. William Bradford, on writing of the Pilgrims landing on America's shores, saw cause, in the face of all problems, for both gratitude and the assurance of victory, writing, quote, what could now sustain them but the Spirit of God and His grace? May not and ought not the children of these fathers rightly say, our fathers were Englishmen which came over this great ocean and were ready to perish in this wilderness, but they cried unto the Lord, and He heard their voice, and looked on their adversity, etc. Let them therefore praise the Lord, because He is good, and His mercies endure forever. Yea, let them which have been redeemed of the Lord show how He hath delivered them from the hand of the oppressor. When they wandered in the desert wilderness out of the way, and found no city to dwell in, both hungry and thirsty, their soul was overwhelmed in them. Let them confess before the Lord His loving kindness and His wonderful works before the sons of men. End quote. If this faith be obsolete, then its victory is obsolete also.